What if the one person everyone trusted finally stopped protecting the story? For years, she was the quiet constant, the calm presence, the reassuring figure standing just off camera while chaos swirled around her daughter and son-in-law. Doria Ragland didn't shout. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't leak texts or wage media wars. She stayed still. And that's exactly why what happened next hit so hard. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because when someone who never speaks suddenly decides to talk, the question isn't why now. It's what finally became impossible to ignore. Tonight's story doesn't begin with palace intrigue or tabloid headlines. It begins in a living room, behind closed doors, in a house the world was told was built on compassion, empathy, and healing. And, according to Doria Ragland, that story was never complete. She would later say, quietly but unmistakably, "I was invisible in my own daughter's home." Let that sink in. Invisible, in her daughter's house, while the world watched that daughter lecture everyone else about kindness, fairness, and respect. So how does a woman go from being celebrated as the grounding force behind Meghan Markle to claiming she was treated like a servant by Meghan and Prince Harry themselves? And why did she wait so long to say anything at all? This matters now because timing is never accidental. When someone breaks silence after years of restraint, it's rarely impulsive. It's cumulative, a slow stacking of moments that eventually collapse under their own weight. And if even half of what Doria is now claiming is true, it doesn't just challenge the public image of Harry and Meghan, it forces an uncomfortable question: what happens when the people who preach empathy fail at most at home? Short sentences matter here, because this isn't abstract. This is personal. For years, Doria was framed as the exception, the stable one, the proof that Meghan came from humility, resilience, and grounded values. She appeared when needed. She smiled when expected. She disappeared when the spotlight moved on. No scandals. No counter-narratives. No bitterness. So ask yourself this: what kind of pressure does it take to push someone like that to speak? Because people who stay silent for years aren't weak. They're careful. They calculate the cost. They understand consequences. And Doria Ragland, of all people, understood what speaking up could cost her. Family, access, peace. Silence, in her case, wasn't passive. Protective of her daughter, protective of her grandchildren, protective of a fragile public story that was already cracking under scrutiny. But silence has a shelf life, and once it expires, the truth doesn't come out gently. It comes out heavy. Doria's claims didn't arrive as a press tour or dramatic interview circuit. They surfaced slowly, carefully, almost reluctantly. That alone raised eyebrows, because if she wanted attention, there were louder ways to get it. Instead, what emerged were fragments, statements, conversations relayed by people who knew her well. And at the center of all of them was the same theme: erasure. Not abuse in the sensational sense, not shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Something colder, being overlooked, being expected to serve, being spoken around, not to. Have you ever been in a room where decisions are made about you, as if you're not there? That feeling has weight, and according to Doria, that weight became unbearable. She wasn't just visiting. She wasn't a temporary guest passing through. She was a mother, a grandmother, a fixture in the narrative. Yet behind closed doors, she says she felt managed rather than welcomed. Useful, but not respected. Present, but unseen. That's a different kind of hurt. And here's where the contradiction sharpens. Because publicly, Harry and Meghan built their brand on compassion, on mental health, on breaking cycles of harm. They spoke eloquently about generational trauma, about listening, about dignity. So how does that coexist with a mother-in-law who says she felt reduced to help? That contradiction is the heartbeat of the story, and it's why the backlash has been so fierce. Some people immediately dismissed her claims. They asked why now. They questioned her motives. Others leaned forward. Because when someone who never sought the spotlight suddenly describes invisibility, people listen, especially when the description isn't dramatic. It's mundane, visible in small ways, being the last to know plans, being expected to step in when needed, then step back out of sight, being thanked publicly but dismissed privately. Those are the details that don't trend well on social media, but they destroy relationships quietly. Doria didn't accuse them of hatred. She didn't call them monsters. That's important. what she described was something subtler and, in many ways, more unsettling. Entitlement wrapped in politeness, expectations disguised as normalcy. A hierarchy that was never announced, but always enforced. And if that sounds familiar to anyone watching, that's not an accident, because most power dynamics don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves through patterns. Who gets asked, who gets told. Who gets thanked, who gets ignored. And according to Doria, over time she realized she was always in the same place in that pattern. At the bottom. Let's pause here and ask something uncomfortable. If this were anyone else making these claims, would we dismiss them so quickly? Or does the resistance come from how much this story disrupts what people want to believe? Because the image of Harry and Meghan as perpetual victims has been powerful, profitable, emotionally resonant. But narratives that strong don't leave room for nuance. They don't leave room for the possibility that pain can coexist with causing pain. That someone can be wounded and still wound others. Doria's silence helped preserve that simpler story for years. Her voice complicates it, and complexity makes people angry, especially when it comes from inside the family. That's why the reaction hasn't just been disbelief. It's been defensive. People asking why a mother would betray her daughter, as if truth-telling and betrayal are the same thing. But what if silence was the real betrayal? Of herself, what if staying quiet meant agreeing to be erased? This is where the emotional core of the story deepens, because Doria didn't just wake up one day and decide to talk. According to those close to her, this had been building for a long time. Moments stacking, slights dismissed, feelings swallowed, until one moment, one comment, one interaction crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She hasn't publicly detailed it in full yet, but those familiar with the situation describe it as small on the surface and devastating underneath. The kind of remark that reveals how someone truly sees you, not as family, not as equal, but as staff. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. That moment, according to sources, was when Doria realized something painful. That the role she thought she occupied in her daughter's life no longer existed. That her presence had become conditional, useful when needed, invisible when not. And here's where timing becomes critical, because this isn't happening in isolation. Public opinion around Harry and Meghan has been shifting, contradictions piling up, stories colliding. And when narratives start to wobble, the people who held them together often feel the tremor first. Doria felt it. She saw the gap between what was said publicly and what was practiced privately widen. And eventually, silence stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like complicity. So she spoke. Not loudly, not theatrically, but enough to change the conversation. Enough to make people uncomfortable. Enough to force a new question into the public space. What if the most honest account of Harry and Meghan doesn't come from critics, but from the woman who stood beside them the longest? And if that's true, what else hasn't been said yet? Because according to those close to the situation, the servant claim wasn't the beginning. It was the breaking point. And what came before it and after it may be far more revealing than anyone expected. But the moment she realized she was no longer family in her own daughter's home, that moment changes everything. And we're just getting to it. Not front and center, not correcting headlines, just there. Standing slightly behind Meghan Markle at public events, sitting quietly during interviews, smiling politely when cameras swept past her face and settled somewhere else. For years, Doria Ragland became something almost symbolic. The calm mother, the grounding force, the woman who didn't need to explain herself. And that silence, it wasn't accidental. Because in families like this, families surrounded by power, publicity, and expectation, silence is often currency. And Doria spent hers carefully. Why didn't she ever speak? Not when Meghan was accused. Not when Harry lashed out. Not when the narrative hardened into something absolute. Us versus them. Doria stayed quiet. And that choice alone made her valuable. To the story. To the image. To the idea that this household was different. But here's the thing. People forget. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means someone is deciding that the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of swallowing what hurts. For years, Doria played the role everyone expected of her. Supportive. Uncontroversial. Reliable. She didn't contradict Meghan's version of events. She didn't undermine Harry's grievances. She didn't complicate the message. And because of that, she was trusted. trusted by the public, trusted by producers, trusted by audiences who saw her as the proof that Meghan's roots were grounded, loving, and real. But trust cuts both ways, because when someone like that finally breaks silence, it doesn't sound like noise. It sounds like truth. Let's rewind. Before the headlines, before the accusations, Doria Ragland was never trying to be part of a brand. She had her own life, her own career, her own identity. And for a long time, she managed to exist adjacent to fame without being consumed by it. That's not easy, especially when your daughter becomes one of the most scrutinized women on the planet. Most parents in that position speak too much, or too little. Doria found a middle ground. She showed up when needed, she disappeared when appropriate. That balance wasn't accidental either. According to people who observed her closely, Doria understood something early on that many didn't. That visibility is not the same as power. And that being visible without power can be dangerous, so she stayed quiet. But staying quiet doesn't mean staying unaffected. Behind the scenes, Doria was watching the same things everyone else was watching, just from a much closer seat. She saw how the narrative shifted, how alliances hardened, how empathy became a talking point rather than a practice. And she noticed something else too. Her role was changing, not announced, not discussed, just adjusted. At first it was subtle, small things, not being looped into plans until the last minute, assumptions made about her availability, tasks assigned casually, without discussion, nothing dramatic enough to complain about, nothing that would make sense to outsiders. But repetition turns small things into patterns. And patterns tell stories. Doria's pattern, according to her later claims, was clear. She was expected to help, to accommodate, to adapt, and then step back out of view. Think about that for a second. Imagine being present in someone's life, not as a guest, not as staff, but as family, and slowly realizing you're being treated as neither, because family is consulted, staff is instructed, and Doria began to feel like she was receiving instructions. Polite ones, softly delivered ones, but instructions all the same. This is where people misunderstand the phrase treated like a servant. They imagine uniforms. Orders barked out, obvious disrespect. That's not what Doria described. What she described was expectation without recognition. The assumption that she would be available, that she would help, that she would step in, and then step aside. And if you've ever been in that position, if you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, you know how that feels. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. They're busy. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. You rationalize. You minimize, because acknowledging the truth would mean confronting something painful, that you might not be valued the way you thought. Doria didn't rush to that conclusion. She gave it time. She gave it grace. Years of it. Which makes the next part important. Because silence isn't passive forever. It accumulates. And over time, it becomes heavy. Those close to Doria say she wrestled with that weight privately. She didn't vent publicly. She didn't recruit allies. She internalized, and the longer she stayed quiet, the harder it became to speak. Because once you're known as the quiet one, your silence becomes expected. People stop checking in. They stop asking how you feel. They assume you're fine. That assumption can be cruel, especially when you're not fine at all. And here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this chapter. Publicly, the household Doria was part of was preaching empathy, mental health awareness, the importance of being seen and heard. Privately, according to Doria, she was disappearing. Not violently, not dramatically, gradually. And that kind of disappearance doesn't leave bruises. It leaves doubt. Doubt about your place, your worth, your voice. At some point, silence stops being a shield. It becomes a cage. People ask why she didn't say anything sooner. But that question ignores something fundamental. Speaking up doesn't just risk conflict. It risks identity. Doria wasn't just speaking as a mother. She was speaking as someone whose entire public image was built on restraint and dignity. Breaking silence meant shattering that image. And once that happens, you don't get it back. She knew that, which is why the moment she finally spoke wasn't impulsive. It was desperate. Those close to the situation describe a growing sense of isolation. Not just emotional, physical. Being present, but peripheral. Being included, but not central. Being thanked, but not respected. And the more this pattern repeated, the more invisible she felt. Imagine walking into a room and realizing the conversation changes when you enter. Not because you're important, but because you're inconvenient. That's a different kind of silence. And it's one Doria reportedly recognized too late. She had become part of the background. Reliable, useful, but not equal. The irony is sharp, because the very qualities that made Doria admirable, patience, discretion, loyalty, were the ones that allowed her to be overlooked. And once that realization set in, everything shifted. She started noticing things she had previously brushed aside. The way requests were phrased, the way gratitude was expressed publicly but not privately, the way her presence was assumed rather than invited. And when someone reaches that stage, the question is no longer, is this happening? It's, why did I accept it for so long? That question is dangerous, because it leads to another one. What happens if I stop? Stop accommodating. Stop smoothing edges. Stop being quiet. What happens if I speak? For a long time, Doria didn't answer that question. She avoided it, because the answer carried consequences. Family fractures, public backlash, loss of access. But then something changed, something specific, a moment so small it would barely register to anyone else. But to Doria, it confirmed everything she had been trying not to see. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't cruel. It was dismissive. And dismissiveness, when it comes from people you love, cuts deeper than anger ever could. That was the moment her silence cracked. Not shattered, cracked. And cracks are enough. Because once silence cracks, truth leaks out whether you're ready or not. What Doria realized in that moment wasn't just that she was invisible. It was that she always had been. And that realization changed the equation completely. Because once you understand your place in someone else's hierarchy, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to pretending. And that's when silence becomes impossible to maintain. It was a decision, a quiet one. The decision that she could no longer carry a story that erased her, that she could no longer protect an image that depended on her invisibility. And if speaking up meant backlash, so be it, because staying silent had already cost her too much. But here's the part people don't yet understand. The servant claim wasn't the beginning of her story. It was the conclusion of years of quiet erosion. And the moment that finally pushed her to that conclusion, it involved a rule that applied only to her. And once you hear what that rule was, you'll understand why Doria Ragland never went back to silence again. She didn't notice it all at once. That's important. Because if someone had walked up to Doria Ragland on day one and said, "You don't belong here," she would have laughed it off. Doria wasn't insecure. She wasn't searching for validation. She had lived a full life long before any cameras followed her daughter. She knew who she was, which is why the feeling crept in quietly, not as rejection, as displacement. At first, everything felt temporary. Suitcases, schedules, jet lag. Doria told herself this was transition. A family adjusting to new pressure, new scrutiny, new roles. Of course things would feel awkward. Of course everyone would be stretched thin. She didn't take it personally. She rarely did. But houses have energy. And Doria began to feel something she couldn't immediately name. She wasn't being pushed out, she was being placed. Placed in a category she had never agreed to. Let's slow this down. Imagine entering your child's home, not as a visitor for a weekend, but as someone expected to be present, available, supportive, helpful. There's a difference between being welcomed and being assigned. Welcomed means asked. Assigned means assumed. Doria noticed the assumptions first. Assumptions about her time, her flexibility, her role. Someone needs help with logistics. Doria will handle it. Someone needs childcare support. Doria's got it. Someone needs an extra set of hands. No need to ask. It wasn't said out loud. That's the trick. It was implied. And implied expectations are the hardest to challenge, because once you challenge them, you look ungrateful. So she complied, because that's what you do when you love someone. You help. You contribute. You make yourself useful. But usefulness is a slippery thing, because once usefulness becomes your primary value, respect starts to fade. Doria began to notice where she sat in conversations, or more accurately, where she didn't. Plans would be discussed around her, not with her. Decisions announced after the fact. Schedules handed down like information she was expected to absorb, not shape. And again, nothing explosive. Nothing you could point to and say, "That's wrong." Just 1,000 small adjustments she was expected to make without complaint. Have you ever been in a space where your presence feels conditional, where you're needed but not centered? That was the shift. Doria wasn't treated badly in the way people expect abuse to look. She was treated politely, cordially, with smiles. And that made it worse, because politeness can hide hierarchy. You don't get yelled at. You get overlooked. You don't get dismissed. You get managed. Managed schedules, managed expectations, managed presence. Doria realized she was being managed when she stopped being asked what she wanted. Meals were planned without checking preferences. Time commitments were assumed. Her personal boundaries blurred into availability. And if she hesitated, if she paused, if she asked for clarification, the tone shifted. Not angry, impatient, as if she were slowing things down. That's when she started feeling like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Only she hadn't invited herself. She was there because she was needed. Needed, but not honored. And here's where the house itself matters. Because a home reflects power dynamics in ways people don't notice. Who moves freely? Who waits? Who adapts? Doria noticed she was always adapting. Adjusting her schedule. Lowering her voice. Making herself smaller. Not because she was told to, because the environment demanded it. And slowly, without anyone saying a word, she felt like she didn't belong in the center of the home anymore. She belonged on the edges. In the background. That's when the phrase invisible began forming in her mind. Not unseen, unacknowledged. She could walk into a room and no one would stop talking. She could leave and no one would ask where she was going. Her presence didn't change the atmosphere, and that's devastating when it happens inside your own family. Think about that. Publicly, Doria was praised, applauded, lifted up as a symbol of strength and grace. Privately, she was fading, and the contrast between those two realities became unbearable. She would later reflect on how strange it felt to be celebrated by strangers while being sidelined at home. That disconnect messes with your sense of reality. You start questioning yourself. Am I imagining this? Am I being sensitive? Is this just stress? And because Doria was self-aware, she interrogated her own feelings constantly. She didn't want to be the problem, so she adjusted again and again, until one day she realized something chilling. No one noticed how much she was adjusting, because no one was watching. Her role had solidified. She was the helper, the one who made things easier so others didn't have to think about her needs. And once someone occupies that role long enough, people forget they ever had needs to begin with. This is where the servant analogy begins to make sense. Not in a literal way, but in a structural one. Servants exist to smooth discomfort for others. Their success is measured by how invisible their labor is. Doria's labor became invisible. Her emotional labor, her time, her flexibility. She wasn't thanked privately because her help was assumed, and assumptions are the enemy of respect. The most painful part wasn't the work, it was the silence around it. No check-ins, no gratitude behind closed doors. No recognition that she was giving more than she was receiving. She began to feel like furniture. Useful, present, but not part of the conversation. And every time she tried to reassert herself, even gently, the response was subtle resistance. A sigh, a pause, a look. Enough to signal, don't make this difficult. That's when the house stopped feeling like a home. It became a workplace. And Doria was unpaid staff. She would later say the hardest part wasn't being asked to help. It was never being asked if she was okay. And if you think that sounds dramatic, consider this. In households built on hierarchy, the people at the bottom are rarely abused loudly. They are ignored quietly. That's what happened here. Doria didn't feel hated. She felt irrelevant. And irrelevance cuts deep when it comes from your own child. Imagine watching your daughter navigate the world, advocate for herself, demand respect from institutions and media, and realizing she wasn't extending that same care inward. That realization creates a specific kind of grief. Not anger, grief. Grief for the relationship you thought you had. Grief for the role you thought you played. Grief for the home you thought was safe. Doria didn't confront this immediately. She sat with it. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe they're under pressure. Maybe they don't realize. Maybe things will change. But time didn't fix it, because patterns don't correct themselves, they entrench. And the more entrenched the pattern became, the clearer it was that Doria's place in the household had been decided without her consent. She wasn't family in the way she expected. She was function. And that realization marked the beginning of the end. Because once you understand that you're valued for what you provide rather than who you are, you face a choice. Accept it. Or disrupt it. Doria wasn't ready to disrupt it yet, but she was done pretending it wasn't happening. And that internal shift changed everything. She started paying attention, noticing details she had previously dismissed. The way requests were phrased, the lack of reciprocity, the emotional distance. And then came the rule. A small rule. A quiet rule, but one that applied only to her. And when she realized that rule existed, it confirmed her worst fear, that she wasn't invisible by accident. She was invisible by design. And once you see that, there's no going back. It's about control, and how loyalty once taken for granted becomes leverage. No one ever said the word servant out loud. That's what makes this part uncomfortable, because when people hear that word, they imagine something obvious. Commands, raised voices, clear humiliation. That's not what Doria Ragland described. What she described was something far more familiar to anyone who has ever been quietly downgraded in a relationship without being told it happened. The realization that expectations had replaced consent. At some point, helping stopped being a choice and became a requirement. And when that shift happens, the language changes, not dramatically. Suddenly, requests become statements. Suggestions become assumptions. Gratitude becomes silence. Doria noticed this shift not through one big moment, but through tone. Tone tells you where you stand. A casual, "Can you just?" A hurried, "We need you to." A dismissive, "It's easier if you handle this." No one asks if you're tired. No one checks if you're free, because your availability is assumed. And once availability is assumed, personhood starts to erode. This is where the servant analogy takes shape. Not as insult, as structure. Servants exist to absorb inconvenience so others don't have to feel it. Doria realized she had become the buffer between stress and calm, between chaos and order, between the household and its image. She smoothed things over, she filled gaps. She adjusted her own needs to accommodate everyone else's. And when you do that long enough, people stop seeing it as effort. They see it as your role. This is where the contradiction sharpens. Publicly, this household spoke endlessly about emotional labor, about the unseen work women do, about acknowledging effort, about respecting boundaries. Privately, Doria's emotional labor went unnamed, unseen, unthanked. That disconnect is what hurt most. Because Doria wasn't asking for praise, she was asking to be seen. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. The expectations placed on her weren't matched by expectations placed on others. She was expected to be flexible. Others were protected. She was expected to adapt. Others were accommodated. She was expected to give. Others were allowed to take. And once she noticed that imbalance, she couldn't stop seeing it. It showed up in schedules. Her time was treated as elastic. Plans changed, and she was expected to absorb the inconvenience. Commitments shifted, and she was expected to rearrange. No one asked if it worked for her. They assumed she would make it work. That assumption is key, because assumptions are built on hierarchy. You don't assume availability from equals. You negotiate. Doria wasn't being negotiated with. She was being directed. And direction implies authority. Now ask yourself this. Who had authority in that house? Who set the pace? Who decided what mattered? It wasn't Doria. And that imbalance played out in ways that were easy to miss but impossible to ignore once you were inside it. She began to feel like her presence was tied to usefulness. If she was helping, she was welcome. If she wasn't, she was in the way. That's a brutal realization for a mother. Because mothers are taught to give endlessly, to sacrifice quietly, to accept inconvenience as love. And Doria had spent her life embodying that ethic. But there's a difference between choosing to give and being expected to give. One is love, the other is exploitation. And exploitation doesn't have to be malicious to be real. That's what people struggle to accept. That harm can occur without cruelty, that someone can genuinely believe they are doing nothing wrong while benefiting from someone else's erasure. Doria wasn't screamed at. She wasn't insulted. She wasn't threatened. She was overlooked. And overlooked people don't leave marks that cameras can capture. They leave exhaustion. resentment, self-doubt. She started questioning herself. Am I overreacting? Am I being sensitive? Is this just how families work under pressure? Those questions kept her quiet longer than anything else. Because once you start doubting your perception, you hesitate to speak. You wait for confirmation. And the confirmation came in the form of inconsistency. Rules that applied to her didn't apply to others. Expectations placed on her weren't shared equally. She noticed how others' boundaries were respected. Appointments honored, time protected, preferences considered. Hers weren't. And when she gently tried to assert them, the response wasn't understanding, it was inconvenience. She had become inconvenient when she stopped being endlessly available. That's when the servant metaphor crystallized for her. Not because she was cleaning floors or wearing an apron, but because her role was to serve the system, to keep things running smoothly, to absorb friction so others could function. And once you see that clearly, it reframes everything. Past interactions take on new meaning. That casual tone, that unreturned thanks, that expectation of compliance, they weren't isolated, they were consistent, which means they weren't accidental, they were learned. And here's the hardest part. Doria didn't believe this started with malice. She didn't think anyone woke up and decided to treat her this way. She believed it emerged organically from power, from entitlement, from being surrounded by staff, systems, and structures designed to anticipate needs. When you live in an environment where help is always available, you start expecting it. And eventually you stop distinguishing between hired help and family help. Help becomes help, and people become functions. Doria became a function. That's why the word servant resonated with her. Not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate. And accuracy can be painful. She also noticed something else. Public gratitude didn't match private reality. She would be praised in interviews, referenced lovingly in speeches, lifted up as an example of strength. But those moments didn't translate into everyday respect. They translated into optics. And optics are different from care. Optics are for audiences. Care is for home. Doria began to feel like she existed for optics. A symbol, a prop, a reassurance. And symbols don't have needs. They have roles. She fulfilled her role publicly, but privately, she was shrinking, emotionally, mentally. She felt herself withdrawing, speaking less, offering opinions less often. Because when your input isn't valued, you stop offering it. And that withdrawal was misread as agreement. Silence mistaken for consent. That's how systems perpetuate themselves. Those close to Doria later said she became quieter over time, not calmer. Quieter. There's a difference. Calm is choice. Quiet can be survival. She didn't want to rock the boat, because rocking the boat risks capsizing everything. Family relationships, access to grandchildren, the fragile peace she was maintaining. So she stayed quiet, until staying quiet started hurting more than speaking would. And that's when the internal calculation shifted. Not overnight, gradually. She started asking herself harder questions. What am I teaching them about how to treat me? What am I modeling by accepting this? What am I sacrificing to keep this image intact? Those questions are dangerous because they demand answers. And once you start answering them honestly, silence becomes a burden you can't carry anymore. But Doria still didn't speak publicly, not yet. Because there was still one line she hadn't crossed, one boundary she hoped wouldn't be tested. She believed there were limits, that despite everything, there was still respect underneath it all. Until the day she discovered there wasn't. Until the rule. The rule that made it clear this wasn't accidental, this wasn't misunderstanding, this was hierarchy. And hierarchy had placed her at the bottom. That rule didn't humiliate her loudly. It humiliated her quietly, by singling her out, by restricting her, by reminding her unmistakably of her place. And once that happened, the word servant stopped being metaphorical. It became explanatory. Because rules are how power reveals itself, what it was, why it existed, and why it changed everything. Because once someone writes rules for you that they don't follow themselves, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. She didn't disappear all at once. That's the thing people don't understand about invisibility. It isn't a switch that flips. It's a dimmer. Chapter 4 begins not with a confrontation, but with a silence so ordinary it almost felt polite. Because once the rule was established, Everything that followed made a kind of quiet sense. Not emotional sense, structural sense. The rule didn't shout, "You are less than." It whispered, "You are managed." And after that whisper, the pattern accelerated. Doria noticed how often she was no longer addressed directly. Questions about plans were routed around her. Decisions involving her time were communicated through others. Information arrived late, incomplete, or already finalized. She wasn't consulted. She was informed. And being informed is not the same thing as being included. That's when the invisibility became unmistakable. Not because she vanished physically, but because her agency did. She was present, yet peripheral. And if you've ever experienced that, you know how destabilizing it is. You begin to question your own relevance. You wonder if you imagined your importance in the first place. Doria had always believed that motherhood guaranteed a certain standing, not authority, but respect. She wasn't trying to run the household. She wasn't trying to control outcomes. She simply assumed she mattered. That assumption was quietly dismantled. It showed up in conversation dynamics. When she spoke, responses were brief, non-committal, sometimes delayed, sometimes absent, not rude, dismissive. And dismissal has a way of shrinking people. She started choosing her words more carefully, speaking less, listening more, waiting for invitations that didn't come. Because when you feel like your presence is tolerated rather than welcomed, you stop asserting yourself. That's human. And the house reflected it. Doors were closed more often. Schedules were tighter. Space felt allocated rather than shared. Doria found herself waiting for cues, waiting for permission that no one had explicitly said she needed. That's when she realized something crucial. The rule wasn't just about behavior. It was about access. Access to space, access to information, access to influence. And access had been quietly restricted. She wasn't told where she could and couldn't be. She just learned where she wasn't expected. And learning that without being told is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have. Because you're always guessing. Am I allowed here? Am I interrupting? Am I overstepping? Those questions erode confidence. They turn presence into anxiety. Doria began feeling like a guest who needed to justify her existence. In her daughter's home, let that land. Invisibility doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like tension, the tension of constantly monitoring yourself. The tension of trying not to inconvenience anyone, the tension of knowing your needs are secondary. She became hyper-aware of her movements, her timing, her tone. Because when you feel invisible, you also feel scrutinized. Every misstep feels amplified. Every request feels risky. And so you stop making requests. She stopped asking for things. Time, space, consideration. Because asking meant acknowledging she wasn't already receiving them. And that acknowledgement hurt more than the denial would. This is how invisibility becomes internalized. You don't just get ignored. You start ignoring yourself. Doria noticed she was skipping meals. Not intentionally, but because meals happened without her being told. She noticed plans were made that she only learned about after they'd already started. She noticed she was often the last to know. That pattern sends a clear message: you're not central. You're not essential. You're optional. And optional people are easy to overlook, especially in households driven by schedules, staff, and image. The more she faded into the background, the easier it became for others not to see her. That's the cruel irony of invisibility. Once it starts, it feeds itself. People assume you don't mind. They assume you prefer it this way. They assume silence equals comfort. And Doria didn't correct those assumptions, because correcting them would mean confrontation. And confrontation threatened everything she was trying to preserve. She still believed at this stage that things could be fixed. That if she stayed patient, stayed supportive, stayed quiet, the dynamic would shift. That this was a phase. Pressure would ease. Normalcy would return. But that hope began to fade when she realized the invisibility wasn't temporary. It was functional. Her absence from conversations made things smoother. Her lack of input reduced friction. Her compliance kept the system efficient, and systems don't change when they work. Even if someone inside them is hurting, Doria began to feel like a ghost. Present, but not quite real. And ghosts don't get acknowledged. They get tolerated. She also began noticing how others interacted with her. Staff treated her kindly. respectfully, but with a certain distance, as if they weren't sure what her status was. Was she family? Was she help? Was she both? That ambiguity mirrored how she felt inside. Unclear, unanchored. And when people don't know how to place you, they often place you lower rather than higher. That's not cruelty, that's hierarchy. Hierarchy thrives on clarity, and Doria's role had been left deliberately unclear, which meant it could be adjusted as needed. That's power. She wasn't asked to weigh in on decisions involving the household. She wasn't asked how she felt about changes. She was expected to adapt. Adaptation over time becomes erasure. Because when you're always adapting, no one adapts to you. She tried to push back in small ways, gentle ways, suggesting alternatives, expressing preferences, nothing confrontational. Just reminders that she existed as a person with opinions. The response was consistent. Polite deflection, non-answers, occasional annoyance, enough to discourage further attempts. So she stopped, and stopping made her more invisible. That's how the cycle tightened. Those close to Doria later said she seemed withdrawn, not depressed, contained, as if she were holding herself together by reducing her footprint, taking up less space, needing less, expecting less. That's not strength, that's survival. The emotional beat here is subtle but devastating. Because Doria wasn't asking to be centered. She was asking not to be erased, and erasure doesn't require cruelty. It requires indifference. That's why this chapter matters. Because indifference is harder to prove than hostility. It doesn't leave evidence. It leaves feelings, and feelings are easy to dismiss. People say things like, "You're reading into it. They didn't mean it." "You're being sensitive," Doria said those things to herself, over and over, until she couldn't anymore. Because there came a point when invisibility stopped being abstract. It became concrete. She was excluded from a moment that mattered. A moment involving family. A moment that in her mind crossed a line. Not because she needed to be in control, but because she needed to belong. That moment isn't public, and it may never be. But those who know about it say it was the first time Doria felt something snap, not anger. Clarity. The clarity that this wasn't oversight. It was structure, and she was positioned at the margins of it. Once she saw that clearly, she stopped internalizing the invisibility as a personal failing. She stopped asking what she had done wrong. She started asking why this system required her silence. That question reframed everything. It shifted the story from personal hurt to power dynamics. From feelings to patterns, and patterns don't lie. The invisibility pattern was consistent, predictable, self-reinforcing. And it existed because it benefited someone. It made things easier, quieter, cleaner. And Doria was paying the price for that ease, emotionally, psychologically. She wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't cry in public. She didn't stage confrontations. She absorbed until she couldn't. That's when invisibility stopped being something that happened to her. It became something she named. And naming it gave it shape. It turned a feeling into an accusation. Not spoken yet, but forming. And once an accusation forms internally, silence is living on borrowed time. The backlash that would come later didn't start with words. It started with this realization, that invisibility was not accidental, that it wasn't a misunderstanding, that it wasn't a phase, it was a condition. And conditions don't improve without change. Doria knew then that something had to give. Either she would continue disappearing, or she would reassert her presence, and reasserting presence in a system built on her erasure would cause disruption. She knew that too, which is why she didn't rush. She waited, she watched, she gathered herself. Where silence becomes a bargaining chip, and where the cost of speaking is finally weighed against the cost of staying quiet. And when that scale tips, nothing stays the same. Loyalty is supposed to be a virtue. That's how this chapter begins. Because for most of her life, Doria Ragland believed loyalty was something you gave freely, not something that could be used against you. Loyalty meant staying, supporting, holding steady when things got hard. And she had done all of that, quietly. Not dramatic exploitation, not obvious manipulation, something more insidious. The kind that only works on people who care deeply. Because loyalty, when taken for granted, becomes leverage. And leverage is power. Doria didn't realize her loyalty had become leverage until she tried to withdraw it just a little. Not fully, not defiantly, just enough to breathe. She declined a request. Not angrily, not even firmly, just gently. And the reaction surprised her. Not outrage, not confrontation. A subtle, heavy disappointment that carried a message louder than anger ever could. You're letting us down. That's when she understood something critical. Her loyalty wasn't appreciated. It was expected. And expectations change the meaning of everything. When loyalty is expected, refusing it feels like betrayal, even when the request is unreasonable. That's how leverage works. Doria had become the emotional constant, the one who didn't complain, the one who absorbed strain, the one who stayed calm when others escalated. And because she was always there, her presence was no longer seen as a gift. It was a guarantee. Guarantees can be exploited. She noticed how quickly the tone shifted when she hesitated. Not angry. Cold. As if she had broken an unspoken agreement. She hadn't signed anything. She hadn't promised anything. But the expectation existed anyway. And that expectation carried weight. Doria began to see how her silence had created a certain dependence. Not emotional dependence. Functional dependence. The household had adjusted around her reliability, around her flexibility, around her willingness to step in. And when she tried to step back, the system resisted. Systems always resist change, especially when that change threatens convenience. This is where guilt enters the picture. Not shouted guilt, implied guilt. Comments like, "We really need you right now. This is a stressful time. Can't you just help with this one thing?" Each request framed as temporary, each one stacked on top of the last. And when she complied, the pressure didn't ease. It increased, because compliance confirms expectation. And expectation grows. Doria realized she had taught people how to treat her. Not intentionally, but consistently. She had taught them that she would always say yes, always adjust, always prioritize their needs over her own. That realization hurt, because it meant part of this dynamic had been co-created, not out of weakness, out of love, out of a desire to keep peace, out of fear that pushing back would fracture relationships that already felt fragile. She had been protecting something. The family, the image, the access to her grandchildren. And those things mattered to her deeply. So she stayed loyal. But loyalty without reciprocity is a trap. It slowly drains you while convincing you that leaving would be selfish. Doria began to feel that trap closing. She noticed how often her emotional needs were deferred, how rarely anyone asked how she was holding up, how conversations centered on others' stress, others' struggles, others' priorities. Her own feelings were assumed to be stable because she appeared calm, because she didn't make noise. But calm isn't the absence of feeling, it's the management of it. And she was managing a lot. She was managing disappointment, managing grief, managing the growing realization that she was valued more for what she provided than for who she was. And that management became exhausting, emotionally. Physically, she started feeling worn down. Not sick, just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with rest. Because it's not physical fatigue. It's emotional depletion. She would lie awake at night replaying interactions. Not arguments. Moments. Moments where she had swallowed words. Moments where she had nodded instead of speaking. Moments where she had chosen peace over honesty. And she started asking herself a question she had avoided for years. What happens if I stop being loyal? Not dramatic disloyalty. Not betrayal. Just boundaries. What happens if I say no? That question terrified her. Because the answer wasn't just conflict. It was loss. Loss of closeness. Loss of access. Loss of whatever fragile place she still held in the family structure. She worried that asserting herself would be interpreted as attack. That voicing hurt would be seen as ingratitude. That acknowledging her own needs would be framed as selfishness. These fears weren't irrational. They were based on experience. Every time she had tried to gently assert a boundary, the atmosphere shifted. Not openly hostile, but strained, uncomfortable. As if she had violated an unspoken rule. That rule was simple. Don't disrupt the narrative of unity, the narrative of shared values, the narrative of a family against the world. Doria had helped sustain that narrative. Her silence was part of it, and she knew that once she spoke, she couldn't control how it would be interpreted. She couldn't guarantee nuance. She couldn't guarantee understanding. She could only guarantee fallout. That's why loyalty felt safer, But loyalty was costing her something. Her sense of self, her dignity, her voice. She began to feel like she was disappearing inside her own life. And that realization forced another question: who am I protecting? The answer used to be simple: her daughter, her grandchildren, the family. But as time went on, that answer became less clear because protection had become one-directional. She was protecting everyone else from discomfort, and no one was protecting her from erasure. That imbalance is unsustainable, and deep down, Doria knew it. She just wasn't ready to act on it yet, because loyalty doesn't dissolve overnight. It frays, slowly, quietly, until one final strain causes it to snap. Chapter 5 is about that fraying, about the moments that didn't make headlines, the conversations that weren't recorded, the emotional negotiations that happened entirely inside Doria's head. She weighed everything: her values, her love, her limits. And she realized something painful: her loyalty was being used as leverage. Not intentionally, perhaps, but effectively, because the threat was always implied. If you speak, you disrupt. If you disrupt, you risk everything. That threat doesn't need to be spoken. It lives in the air. It lives in the pauses. It lives in the way people respond when you push back. Doria felt that threat. She lived with it. And for a long time, it worked. She stayed quiet. She stayed loyal. She stayed small. Until the day she didn't. That day didn't start with an argument. It started with exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that makes silence feel heavier than speech. The kind of exhaustion that makes you realize you can't keep paying the price of peace with your own identity. And that's when the equation changed. For the first time, Doria seriously considered what it would mean to stop protecting the narrative, to stop absorbing the strain, to stop being the buffer. That consideration alone was radical. Because once you imagine life on the other side of silence, you can't unimagine it. And that imagination opened a door she had kept closed for years. Behind it was conflict, backlash, misunderstanding, but also something else: relief, the possibility of being seen. Not as a symbol, not as support staff, but as a person. That possibility became more appealing than the safety of silence. And once that happened, loyalty lost its grip. It no longer felt virtuous. It felt costly, and costs demand evaluation. Doria began to understand that staying loyal wasn't neutral. It was a choice. A choice to continue disappearing. A choice to continue being leveraged. And if she was going to make a choice, she wanted it to be conscious, intentional, grounded in self-respect. That's when she stopped automatically saying yes. That's when she started pausing. That's when she started noticing how much resistance even small changes created. And that resistance told her everything she needed to know. Because when a system pushes back against your boundaries, it's admitting it benefited from your lack of them. That realization was the final thread pulling loose. She didn't announce anything. She simply stopped cushioning, stopped smoothing, stopped erasing herself for the sake of harmony. And the reaction to that shift was immediate, not explosive, revealing. The disappointment returned, the impatience, the subtle pressure to fall back into place. That pressure confirmed her fear. Her loyalty had never been optional, it had been assumed. And once she stopped offering it freely, the system didn't adapt, it tightened. And that tightening led directly to the moment that changed everything, the moment when a line was crossed. The moment when loyalty was no longer enough, the moment when silence became impossible. Because the next chapter isn't about leverage, it's about a comment. One sentence, spoken casually, dismissively, a sentence that revealed exactly how Doria was seen. And once she heard it, she knew there was no going back, because some things can be endured. Some can be forgiven, but some cannot be unheard. And what was said to her that day? It stripped away any remaining illusion and forced her to finally choose herself. She didn't think it would be that sentence. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, not with drama, with a sentence so casual it almost slipped past her. Almost, because the most revealing truths aren't always delivered loudly. They're delivered comfortably, spoken by people who believe they're entitled to say them. The moment arrived on an ordinary day, no special occasion, no heightened emotions, just logistics. That's what made it so devastating. Doria wasn't braced for it. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't prepared. She was doing what she had done countless times before, helping, being available, filling a gap that needed filling. And then it came, a comment tossed out without hesitation. Not cruel in tone, not sharp in delivery, just final. It framed her presence, not as family, not as choice, but as obligation, as function, as something that existed to be used. Those close to the situation won't repeat the sentence verbatim, not because it was obscene, but because it was revealing of how she was seen, not as a mother whose time mattered, not as a woman with boundaries, but as someone whose role was to comply. The kind of sentence you say when you assume authority, the kind you don't bother to soften, because you don't think it needs softening. Doria froze. Not physically, internally. She would later describe the feeling as a drop, like something inside her fell through a floor she didn't know was hollow. Everything slowed down. She replayed the words in her head. Once, twice, again, waiting for them to sound different, waiting for them to make sense in a kinder way. They didn't. Because intent wasn't the issue. Assumption was. The sentence assumed she would do what was asked, that she would adjust, that she would not object. It assumed she had no competing needs, no limits, no agency. And in that assumption, something crystallized. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress. This wasn't pressure. This was how she was seen. That realization landed hard because it reframed every moment that came before it. All the small slights, all the unasked favors, all the silent expectations. They weren't accidents. They were consistent with this view. And once you understand how someone sees you, you understand how they'll treat you. Doria didn't respond immediately. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She stood there, nodding slightly. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, everything did. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't explode, they settle. And once they settle, they change the terrain permanently. She realized in that instant that the hierarchy she had sensed wasn't just implied. It was acknowledged. That sentence was confirmation. Confirmation that her time was not her own. Confirmation that her presence was instrumental. Confirmation that her role was subordinate. And the most painful part, it wasn't said with malice, it was said with certainty. As if this was obvious. As if there was no reason to question it. As if she had already agreed. That's what hurt. Because agreement had never been given. It had been assumed. And assumptions erase consent. Doria excused herself shortly after. Not dramatically, just quietly. She needed air, space, time to understand what had just happened. She went somewhere alone and sat with it. Not the sentence itself, what it represented. She asked herself a question she had been avoiding for years. Is this how they see me? Not just in this moment, but always. The answer terrified her, because it explained too much. It explained the invisibility, the expectations, the lack of consultation, the assumption that she would always be there to absorb inconvenience. She wasn't family in the way she believed. She was infrastructure. And infrastructure is noticed only when it fails. She realized then why gratitude had felt hollow, why public praise hadn't translated into private respect, because praise was symbolic. Respect would have required consideration, and consideration had been absent. She replayed other moments through this new lens. Times she had hesitated and felt pressure, times she had set boundaries and felt resistance, times she had gone quiet to avoid being difficult. All of it fit. That sentence wasn't an anomaly. It was the truth spoken out loud. And once truth is spoken, silence becomes unbearable. Doria felt a wave of grief. Not anger, grief. Grief for the relationship she thought she had with her daughter. Grief for the home she thought was safe. Grief for the version of herself who believed patience would be rewarded. She also felt shame. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she had allowed herself to be diminished. That's a hard thing to admit, especially for someone who prides themselves on strength. She asked herself another question. If this were happening to someone else, what would I tell them? The answer was immediate. You deserve better. That answer lingered because she had never applied it to herself. Not in this context. She had always prioritized peace, harmony, access. But now she understood the cost. Peace had been purchased with her dignity, and that price was too high. She also understood something else in that moment. Speaking up would change everything. Not speaking up would change nothing. She couldn't unknow what she knew now. She couldn't pretend the sentence hadn't been said. She couldn't go back to interpreting actions generously. The lens had shifted. And once a lens shifts, clarity replaces hope. Doria didn't confront the sentence directly that day, not because she was afraid, because she was processing. She needed to decide what kind of woman she would be next. Would she continue to swallow it, or would she finally say something? That decision didn't come immediately. But the direction was set. Those close to her say she was different afterward. Not loud, not hostile, just present.